Jim Stewart again, another dose of historical tonic for fragile white folks. Last time we did some pretty gruesome interrogation of the big sweep of violence in American history that involved white people showing up, because they certainly did in all of those lists. Remembering again, whether we like it or not, we and our representatives are showing up, we white folks. That was a tough lesson. This one's going to be even tougher. Again, the point is to be able to emphasize just how complete and predictable in African American experience the white law of gravity actually is. This time, the white noise gets very noisy, because today's topic is all about lynching. And in order to be able to deal with lynching, which is probably as difficult a matter to think about, let's imagine once again Ida B. Wells. Remember her? She's our muse. She's been listening to this one-way conversation with the hope that one way or another it makes some sort of impression and does good for all of us, me included. Lynching was Ida B. Wells' repertorial specialty. She started when she was a young girl and responding to what began as a game of marbles between a black kid and a white kid on the street corner in her town that ended up being the lynching and the murder of the black kid as a consequence of what began as a quarrel over who was winning the marble game. By the time it was done, a white mob had desecrated a black body, and her career as a journalist, reporting on, exposing, naming names, giving gruesome descriptions. This is a young African-American woman confronting white society in its worst forms, and at the same time creating a kind of standing up challenge to white Americans that does qualify her to be both a Pulitzer Prize winner and our historical muse and guide for this particular section. Lynching is something that you know all about from grisly scenes that you've seen reproduced on television, because people took pictures of them all the time. And these became trophies. We also know lots of things about the mutilization of bodies. We're not going to talk about any of that here. What we're going to talk about instead is what's on the screen, and that's a map. And that's a map of racial terror and lynchings from 1880 to 1940. Notice they're concentrated in the Deep South, but they happen all the way all over the United States. Now we have to stop for a minute and understand what a lynching is not. A lynching is not a murder, okay? It's much more than a murder. It's a public ritual that is even distinguished from, say, for example, a terrorist group beheading a victim with a big sword in front of a lot of people. A lynch mob is something else. It involves the participation, willing or unwilling, of the entire community. Imagine yourself being a white person in the middle of a lynching and you hate what you're seeing. It disgusts you, it horrifies you. You're surrounded by people who are cheering. What do you do? If you're cheering, how do you remember this? How do you go home and talk to your children about it? How do African American families not participating except by shutting the door, hiding in the woods, hoping against hope not to be next? Those memories shatter down through the ages right into the present. Right now in Duluth, Minnesota, way far away from Mississippi, there's a constant debate about how to make amends and reparations for 3 carnival workers, African American guys who brought the circus to town, who ended up being strung up on lamp poles in the early part of the 20th century. So lynching is not just an event. Lynching is a complex, difficult, almost unimaginable, agonizing trauma on the past that bleeds into the present over and over and over again. Now, in order to be able to understand this perfectly, and I can't provide a visual symbol that that does justice of what I'm going to recommend. There's an activist, a scholar, a brilliant man, African-American guy named Bryan Stevenson, who is the head of a national initiative called the Justice Project. He and a lot of other very imaginative and very, very courageous people have put together a lynching memorial, a lynching museum in Birmingham, Alabama. You walk in and you walk under hanging objects that don't quite look like people, but don't quite look like sandbags either. A representation for each person lynched in the United States. Outside are memorials and plaques to all of them. Walking through it is an experience that tells you why you need to represent lynching symbolically and in a way that begins to understand that this is the bone marrow of what white supremacy is really all about. It's living in an age and in a constant threat of terrorism. So when you look at the map, all you see is bright spots, red spots, and darker spots as you recede north. But if you look at the map carefully, you'll find that those dots extend all the way to Fargo, North Dakota. If you go to Sioux Falls, South Dakota right now, you'll find that a group of high school students began researching for part of their history project events that happened back then. They came upon the lynching of William Brown in 1897, exposed this to their city council, and the debate has been ever since, what do we do to make amends? Like the long list that we looked at in the last session, chronicling each event of violence packed against Black people in American history, we're seeing again what the law of gravity feels like on a grand scale. Remembering also at the same time that there is the counter narrative. A wonderful historian by the name of Carlos Hill has written a book called Beyond the Rope, which is a historical study of African-American resistance to lynching, which begins to explain why there's such strong support among many African-American communities for the Second Amendment, for the right to bear arms, and why, until just recently, white society, especially in the South, was very interested in trying to put together gun legislation programs that would keep rifles and handguns out of the hands of free Black people. It's a lot to swallow, but it's a lot of doses of building your courage, owning the consequences of the history. You've never lynched anybody. You wouldn't want to do that. But instead of saying, I am culpable for all that stuff that happened back there, remember they did that. Your choice, my choice, our choice is to own that history and to turn it in a different direction.